Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Intro to Philosophy. Let's get started on philosophy of mind today. This will just be a little introduction, just to think about some general issues before we get to specifics. Okay, so this is philosophy of mind. And we can separate out these different kinds of questions, right? Hopefully, you're all aware of this terminology by now, metaphysics and epistemology, right? This has to do with what reality is like. This has to do with what we can know about it, how we can know about it, having to do with knowledge, having to do with reality over here. Semantic questions having to do with meaning, the meanings of terms, right? So it's important when we do philosophy of mind, and we're going to ask what the mind is and how we can explain it. We might have to think a little bit about what we even mean by that word. What does mind mean, right? Does it refer to a kind of a thing or a substance, whatever it is that has the capacity for thought and sensory awareness, right? Whatever it is that can feel and think, whatever it is that you think the mind does, that's just what the mind is, something like that. Uh, or is it just sort of a catch-all word for a bunch of different cognitive processes? You might think, for example, think of an analogy. You might be talking about, instead of the mind, the economy. Economy sounds like it names some sort of thing that you can point to, but it's not really like that, right? Economy just refers to a whole bunch of processes that are happening all over the world. There isn't some one thing called the economy. So we might think the same thing about the mind. Does mind refer to some kind of thing, some sort of thing you can point at or define in an easy way as its own thing? Or is it just a way of talking about all these different processes? These are questions you'd want to think about. Metaphysical questions, well, if we've figured out what we think the mind is in general, then we might want to ask, well, what is the relationship between the mind and the body? Or maybe you want to get specific and talk about the brain. Right? Is the mind a kind of immaterial thing? Right? Some sort of immaterial substance? Remember, Descartes thought that, right? Rene Descartes thought that our minds are defined by the things they do, and they're definitely not extended in space. They're not physical objects at all. They're non-physical objects. They're their own kind of substance. But then you might want to ask, well, what though? What is it? Right? At least with the brain, we can sort of look at the brain and study it. But if you say that the mind is somehow made of some sort of immaterial stuff, that raises some questions like, well, what kind of stuff is it? Right? We'd want to know about that. How is that supposed to work? And if it is some sort of immaterial thing, the way Descartes thought, the way that many people do, right? The way that people think souls inhabit the body, right? Souls are somehow these immaterial things that can keep existing after the body dies. The body is its own thing, right? Well, then that raises the question, how can those two kinds of things interact? As far as we know, with physical objects can bump into another physical object and make something happen, right? All physical movements can be explained by other physical things happening. Physical processes cause other physical processes to happen. But how does that work with the body, right? If my mind is the thing that's, if I decide to raise my hand, that's something that my mind does, right? In my mind, I have the thought, I'm going to raise my hand, and then up my hand goes. So there seems to be this interaction between my mind. It seems as though my mind is causing my hand to raise when I make that decision. But if that decision is made in some sort of immaterial substance, how does that decision get translated to the physical realm? It's just a huge mystery to think about that. If you think the mind is something separate from the body, there's this huge issue about the way in which something like that would interact with physical things. Right? Not to say that it's impossible. It's just a huge question, right? Huge problem to solve. Uh, and we might want to ask, can the mind exist independently of the brain? This is certainly, again, what Descartes thought, that the mind is its own thing. You can have conscious experiences even without a brain, right? Or do we think that the brain is a necessary condition for the mind, that without a brain, there's just nothing going on. There's no consciousness, whatever else you might want to call it. You could get all woo about it and say that there's some sort of energy left behind when your body dies. But what we're interested in here is you as a conscious being with memories and a personality. Does any of that survive when the brain is no longer functioning? Right? A very sort of scientifically minded person might say no, brain processes are responsible for all your mental processes ultimately. Somebody else might say no, that's not the case. That we are somehow hooked up to our brain. Maybe the brain is like some sort of mediator. Who knows how you'd want to cash that out. But this is certainly a big question to think about. Okay. Or, as I was just sort of hinting at, right? Maybe the mind just is the brain, or maybe mental processes are just explainable in terms of brain processes. And that's a possibility as well, right? This is where you get the sort of the computer analogy that our minds and all our mental capacities, they're just like software running on the hardware of the brain. This makes some bit of sense because we do know that if you change certain things about the brain, the hardware, you end up messing with certain things about the mind, the software. And there's lots of famous examples from psychology. One of the most famous ones is the case of Phineas Gage, who got this rod rammed through his brain, somehow survived, but his whole personality changed after that. So radically altered the hardware of the brain, and then his whole personality, his whole demeanor just completely changed. How is that possible if your personality is somehow housed within your soul, and that's an immaterial thing that's safe from pokers and things like that? So one way of really asking the big question is, can we give a scientific account of mental processes? What about consciousness? Remember, for Descartes, that would not be possible. Science has to do with physical objects in the physical world. We can bring Newtonian physics to bear on scientific questions because it's all just about matter and motion. Can we do that for our mental capacities? Can we do that for consciousness itself? Consciousness ends up being a very difficult, very slippery thing to think about. It's very difficult to think about it as somehow a physical thing, but at the same time, there are certain problems associated with that kind of substance dualism that you might then be tempted towards. So problems on all sides, but this is one way of asking a big question about the mind. Is this a proper object of study for science? Certain psychology seems to think so, right? Psychology is the science of the mind. Neuropsychology is a big field, and brain science in general is looking at the way that the brain structures and processes give rise to all sorts of mental phenomena, cognitive phenomena. So there seems to be some reasons for thinking that we can look at the mind scientifically, but that involves the idea that the brain is somehow ultimately responsible for all this stuff. But then there are also reasons to push back against that. There are reasons to think that no, a purely materialistic kind of approach just does not capture something that's very special about consciousness. And we'll look at some of those problems. Now, of course, all this raises epistemological questions, right? We've got these big metaphysical questions. How do we go about answering them? We just sort of appeal to our common sense. Maybe you're having that reaction to all of this. Maybe you think exactly what your mind is, or maybe you think you know exactly what your mind is, right? And all this philosophical talk is just kind of dumb because you know exactly what it is. That's possible, right? You just have an intuitive sense, or maybe we learn it from religion, right? So certainly it's true that many of the religions teach that your soul will keep on existing after your body dies. Well, that right there embodies a kind of philosophy of mind. It says that you as a distinct personality will continue to survive and have experiences long after your brain ceases to function. Right? That's a philosophy of mind. It's a particular theory of the mind which says that like Descartes said, that the mind is separate from the body. Right? That's what religions say. Of course, there are epistemological problems with this as well that we'll get into when we do philosophy of religion, right? Which religion? Why a religion? What is the epistemology of religions? How do religions get their facts right? All sorts of problems and questions over there. Just introspection. This is what Kant kind of did, right? Remember Immanuel Kant just sort of thought about the nature of his experience, and if our experience is structured a certain way, our minds must be there to do the structuring. So there are certain things you can think about the mind, perhaps just by thinking real hard, or just by looking at the mind from the inside, or maybe conceptual analysis, right? Maybe we just need to get a good idea of the concepts involved, and we just need to get clear about our ideas, and then all the metaphysical questions maybe will be easy to answer. Who knows? Or science. Do we go to science for the answers? All sorts of different possibilities, things to think about. I'm not going to tell you which one I think is right, if any. These are just questions that you have to struggle with when you're thinking about this stuff. So some of the different metaphysical positions that are available that we know about, we looked at this. This was George Berkeley's idea, right? His whole idea is that actually only minds and their ideas exist, and there aren't any mind-independent material objects out there. So in that view, the brain isn't even really a physical thing. The brain is just an idea in your mind, just like everything else is. Very strange. This view is not taken very seriously, and we're not really going to talk a lot about it. That's not to say that it's definitely wrong or stupid or anything like that. It's just that we want our discussions here to reflect the discussions that are going on still in philosophy, which is not much about idealism. Most people do not take that very seriously, right? We think that physical objects exist independently of our looking at them, and our brains are really there even when we're not observing them. A more common view, this was Descartes' view, and it's a view that's embedded in many religious traditions, right? That there's non-physical thinking stuff on the one hand, and there's physical stuff on the other hand. Right? So there's these thinking unextended substances called minds, and they are somehow related to the physical extended stuff. That's substance dualism. On the other hand, we've got physicalism, which says that no, that's kind of, it's kind of weird and spooky and much too mystical for a modern scientific outlook on the world, which says that no, there's just what exists is what physics and science shows us exist. They've got the right epistemology, they've got the right kind of process of gathering knowledge, and just look how successful science is, right? Look at all the stuff that we can do with technology. There's a huge argument to be made that science has a good epistemology, right? Gets us firm knowledge. And so science seems to show us that there's just physical stuff. There aren't any real spooky spirits or anything like that. And that would include a non-physical mind that can survive the death of the body. So physicalism is going to say, whatever the explanation of our conscious states, our mental capacities and processes are, whatever the explanation is, it's going to have to be in the same terms that everything else in science is, right? Reducible down to atoms, basically, in the end. Remember the great chain of being, right? Where, yes, you can have molecular scientists looking at molecules and studying them at that level, and then you can have biologists at a higher level looking at the whole organism, but then ultimately all that stuff, all these different levels of reality, ultimately you get down to these little bitty atoms, and that's what ultimately everything reduces down to. That seems to be a kind of a scientific, materialistic approach that a lot of people find tempting. And so they think, well, whatever the explanation is, it's going to have to be in terms of physical things that we can actually study empirically through the methods of science. Everything else is just going to be sort of just mythology and superstition, perhaps. Yeah. And there are different ways to be a physicalist, and we're going to look at these views in a little bit more detail. An early physicalist philosophy or psychology of mind is behaviorism. Many of you may have heard of this already, right? On this view, there really aren't any entities called minds. We have a bunch of mental terms like thinking and feeling and being in pain and remembering. But these words really ultimately just refer to observable behavior. And that's all there really is to it. That's one view. There are good things to say about this view. There are also huge problems, and we'll get into those a little bit. Mind-brain identity theory just tries to simplify the whole thing. Just says, okay, let's just get down to it. The mind just is the brain. All that stuff that we say that the mind can do, thinking, remembering, feeling, that's just the brain doing it. Okay? So that's definitely a very physicalist kind of view. And functionalism is very close to it, but it prefers to define the mind in terms of what the brain does. This is a functionalist approach, meaning it's just a matter of taking an environmental input and getting some sort of behavioral output. It doesn't have to be the brain that does it on this view, right? So this view is very friendly to AI, for example. So it doesn't have to be a physical, squishy human brain. Maybe it could be a computer or something like that. As long as it can take that environmental input and get the right kind of behavioral output, if it's like a human being, then we can say that whatever is doing that is thinking and feeling and being conscious. On that view, these all have their own individual problems, and we'll get into them. They all have their individual arguments for them as well. Okay. Finally, last of all, I should briefly mention this distinction here. We keep talking about dualism, and what we're talking about is substance dualism. Right? This is Descartes' kind of dualism, where basically there's two kinds of things in reality. All reality breaks down into two different substances: thinking substances and extended substances. Thinking substances are minds or spirits or souls, and extended substances are everyday three-dimensional objects that science can study. That's substance dualism. But there's another view as well called property dualism. Right? Property dualism, usually it's proposed by physicalists, people who think that ultimately it does all reduce down to matter and motion that science can study, but matter can have non-physical properties. So we get something like this. Yeah, ultimately there's just physical stuff, right there. But physical stuff can have lots of different properties. So it can have physical properties like being, weighing a certain amount, or whatever physical properties you want to talk about, how fast it's moving, things like that. But then maybe physical stuff can have non-physical properties as well. So if the physical stuff that we're talking about is the brain, the brain certainly has all these physical properties, right? It has a certain mass and a certain size and shape. Neurons are firing, all this physical stuff that's happening. But perhaps brains are so cool and fancy that they actually give rise to non-physical properties. We might call this emergent properties. Very fancy emergent properties, to the point where we can no longer understand them physically, and we have to understand them in non-physical terms. So this is very appealing for a variety of reasons, because if you think that somehow consciousness is not reducible to just physical stuff, but you're still also kind of scientifically minded, and you think ultimately at the bottom it's all just physical stuff, but if you get the right kind of physical stuff and the right kind of structure, then maybe every now and then you get these cool emergent properties, and we talk about those properties in non-physical ways. So in this view, minds are not separate things that get to survive, right? They would just be emergent properties of purely physical stuff. This is, again, that sort of hardware versus software kind of view, right? So we can talk about a computer in terms of its physical properties, and you can look at its insides, that we can look at computer guts and say all these physical things about it, the size and shape and how fast the electrons are moving, all sorts of stuff like that. But then we can also talk about the software, and software, it's a little bit weird to think about software in a physical way. You can't really measure software. The best you can do is measure the hardware that drives the software. So this kind of view is attractive if you don't want to be a complete reductionist. You still think that there's something non-physical about consciousness or the mind, but you don't think that that can exist without the physical stuff, just like we don't think software can exist without the hardware, right? So that's a possibility to keep in mind here, right? You have a very kind of reductionistic physicalism that says it's just atoms, right? That's it. We never get to anything non-physical. Everything is always physical. That's that's kind of a reductionist physicalist view. But then there's also more of a non-reductionist physicalist view, which says there really are non-physical properties, but they are, the result. They are emergent properties of physical stuff. Okay, that was it for now. I'll post something else later. We'll review Descartes' substance dualism first, then we'll look at behaviorism, then we will look at functionalism, and then mind-brain identity theory. Oh, sorry, mind-brain identity theory first, and then functionalism. All right, have a good day, everyone. I hope you're doing good, and I'll see you later.